Sophie. Well, welcome back, everybody. This is, as Sophie said, the 4th webinar, and of course, all of our webinars are brought to you by the Colorado Farm to School Task Force with Spark Policy Institute. And as a reminder, the task force in Colorado was mandated by the Colorado General Assembly in 2010, and it has 15 appointed members. It is charged with increasing the use of local farm and ranch products and school food service programs to improve child nutrition and strengthen local and regional agricultural economies. Our task force receives no funding from the state of Colorado. However, it has successfully attracted a wide array of funders and currently is being supported through the Colorado Health Foundation and the Gates Family Foundation. Spark staffs the task force and provides a wide range of services, including research, regulatory and legal analysis, evaluation, facilitation, and trainings. In 2012, the task force identified a major gap in farm-to-school programming in Colorado. We simply had very little information about what our districts were doing, and the districts that were engaged in farm-to-school were not systematically assessing their farm-to-school activities. To address this gap, the task force, along with Spark Policy Institute, developed the Farm-to-School Evaluation Toolkit for Colorado. With a 2-year USDA Farm-to-School grant, the toolkit is now being rolled out nationwide through in-person workshops and webinar trainings. Today's webinar is the 4th in the 5-part series of Farm-to-School Evaluation Toolkit training. We'll be focusing on how to collect and analyze your evaluation data. All the webinars are archived at the link on this slide. So let's get started by doing a quick poll.
Okay, hi everybody. So on the right side of your screen, in just 1 second, will appear a poll. And as usual, we'd like to know who in the audience has attended what previous webinars. So you'll have 30 seconds to answer, and go ahead and select whichever answer makes sense for you. Okay, we have 10 more seconds for those of you who haven't answered yet. Okay, it looks like over half of you have seen all 3, and then some of you have seen some of the previous webinars. So that's great.
Okay, thank you. Oh, it's hard to hear? Okay. So thank you for telling us that. I'm going to speak a little bit closer to my microphone and see if that helps. Maybe if whoever's having a hard time hearing, if you could let us know if it sounds better at this point. And please do type in the chat. Send to all panelists so that both Sophie and I can see it if there is an issue. So thank you. Let her know if it sounds better, please. You should have received these handouts, and you know, great, that you know that where you can find them. You can download them here at the Evaluation Toolkit site on our Farm to School site or on the links that are in the chat box. Today, we're going to start with a quick overview of what we've learned so far. Then we're going to look at different types of data collection strategies. From there, we're going to discuss how to analyze quantitative and qualitative data. And as always, we'll end with a few links to additional resources and how to sign up for next week's webinar if you have not already done so. Then we'll open it up for Q&A. Along the way, we'll be doing short polls and asking you to share ideas through the chat box. By the end of the training, you will have increased your knowledge about data collection and analysis, learned how to implement your evaluation, and you'll be continuing along that path of building your confidence and skills to undertake an evaluation. Let's take a real quick look at where we have been. Let's first start with the Farm to School Evaluation Toolkit itself. As you know, the toolkit overview walks you through each step of the evaluation process. We began this series with an overview of the toolkit and filling out step 1 on the evaluation plan template. In week 2, we identified outcomes and target audiences for your evaluation. Last week, we focused on Step 3 and began Step 4. Today, we're working on Step 5, completing your evaluation plan. In our webinar training series, we cover every step, and you will work with the template and attachments along the way. An important tool in this toolkit is that evaluation plan template. This is the document you all have been systematically filling out each week. Let's have a quick reminder of what we covered last week, as that learning is highly related to what we'll be doing today. Last week, we talked about quantitative and qualitative methods, including the advantages and challenges to each. We also looked at some guidelines for how to adapt an existing tool and develop your own questions. We introduced some questionnaire design best practices about the wording of questions. And finally, we talked about the critical importance of pre-testing your instrument, even if you decide to use an existing data collection tool that you haven't changed at all. It's still going to be used with your audience, and you need to pre-test it with your audience. Finally, at the end of last week's webinar, you began filling out the steps involved for each of your data collection efforts. You assigned a timeline to each step, and you identified the key staff that would be responsible for those steps. Before we go any further, I'd like to hear what your current plans are about data collection types.
Hi, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me a little bit better this time. I'm going to go ahead and open the poll on your right, and please let us know what types of data you'll be collecting, numbers, words, or both. Or if you're not sure yet, that's okay too. Okay, great. It looks like most of you are using a mixed method approach, which is both quantitative and qualitative.
Well, that warms my heart. I think that quantitative and qualitative, or this mixed method approach, as Sophie mentioned, is really the most powerful way to tell your story. So to the extent that you can do that, that's a really good approach. Okay. The very first thing I want to do before we delve into today's training is I want to acknowledge that these webinars have become increasingly content-rich and a lot of information that I am trying to share in just 60 minutes, so I know it's difficult to take notes. On that perspective, what I want to do is encourage you today to sit back and listen. If you're like me, I always want to take notes, but I really am hoping that you will do better if you just sit back and listen, and I promise you that I will send out the PowerPoint with its notes to everyone who's participating today. And in fact, actually, I'm going to do this with all of the previous webinars too, so that you will have this as part of your toolkit. So, okay, sit back and listen and enjoy and learn a lot. Let's get going. I'm going to start with a cartoon because I love the message here that it brings into question the potential messiness and unexpectedness of data collection. Here we have to ask, who is actually collecting the data, and what type of data is being collected, and what does that data mean? No doubt the postgraduate student believes he is the data collector. He's counting how many times that mouse hits the lever as a response to an experimental stimulus. He's conducting a quantitative study that will lead to, at a minimum, some descriptive statistics of counts and percentages in response to his stimulus. But the postgraduate student is not the only data collector. Indeed, the mouse is conducting her own experiment. She's watching the graduate student's reaction every time she pushes on that lever, her experimental stimulus. She's conducting a qualitative study, noting the human's emotional reactions to her experiment. This cartoon says one more important thing, that what we think we are collecting may not be what we are actually wanting to collect. Last week's webinar helped to set you up for success to ask the right questions and track the meaningful activities and actions. But now we want to be mindful about the way we collect our data to ensure that we're collecting what we intended to collect. During the first webinar in this series, we talked about existing data and the importance of identifying what is already being collected that could be useful to your evaluation. One question submitted in last week's post-webinar survey was how to get a food service director to share his or her records. It's a great question. My answer to this is that the most successful strategy will be to ask at the very beginning of your evaluation that food service director to join your team. There are many reasons for recruiting different people to be on your evaluation team, but one of those reasons is to have access to existing data or to have access to the people you want to survey or interview. If you're not able to recruit the food service director or some other key stakeholder on your team, then the next best option is to explain to the person the purpose of your evaluation, that you're doing this evaluation, and ask them if there are any issues that they would like to learn about through your evaluation. Here, what you're doing is giving the opportunity for them to give you some important feedback that you really would need, and that's why you wanted them to on your evaluation team, but you're also creating that buy-in. So when you ask them for their records, they're going to be more willing to want to work with you. The same goes with other school records. Remember to make connections early in your evaluation planning with all these people who will be important to the successful implementation of your evaluation. Now, it's really important to remember this. You do not want to drown in data. Before you decide which data collection instruments you will use and how you will adapt it, consider these questions. What types of data are you and your evaluation team comfortable analyzing and summarizing? If you do not have anyone on your team who knows how to analyze scale data, for example, that's those things that are rated on a scale of, say, 1 to 5, you should opt for categorical data like yes-no questions, where you can just report on the counts or percentages. Remember, the more questions you ask, the more data you will collect, which means the more data you'll need to analyze. As we mentioned last week, you want to keep your data collection focused and efficient, both for yourself and also for your participants. Open-ended questions produces what we call qualitative data. Don't be fooled into thinking qualitative data is easier to analyze or summarize than quantitative data. We'll talk about how to analyze both types today, and you'll see that analyzing qualitative data is a systematic process too. Let technology help you out whenever possible. Online survey sites are a great way to lessen the burden of collecting your data, whether you're doing a survey or even an interview. But it's not just about the technology. Automation can refer to being strategic about where and when you collect your data. So, for example, if you want teachers to complete your survey, find out if there's a teacher planning meeting in the school, and then see if you can distribute your survey at the meeting. Leave a box in the room for them to drop their completed surveys. You may be tempted to get feedback from everyone who participates in your program. This may be an appropriate strategy if the program serves a very small audience. But with a large group of participants, this can be an approach can be a waste of time and money. So instead of collecting information from everyone touched by your program, you can learn just as much by collecting information from a sample of participants. We're going to be talking about sampling today. Now I want to focus on data that you'll be collecting through different types of data collection instruments. First, we'll talk about common ways of collecting quantitative data. First, let's consider why you would collect quantitative data. Numerical data is often gathered for evaluations, and quantitative data is often seen as more objective. Whether or not this is true is actually a topic that could be the sole focus of several webinars. Suffice it to say that there are those who believe numbers are less biased and more representative of the population than qualitative data. If your target audience for your evaluation has this belief, be sure you collect some quantitative data. Quantitative data methods are especially useful if you want to gather information on a lot of people, more than you could, for example, in an interview. It's good for answering questions about what is happening in your program, such as what are the parents' attitudes about school gardens? What are the shifts in students' attitudes toward healthy eating for those who participate in the garden program compared to those who do not? Quantitative data also answers questions about how many, such as how many students are benefiting from the school garden, how many pounds of produce are being harvested, and how many producers are selling to the school. A research design refers to the systematic process by which you'll implement your evaluation. It's good to keep in mind your research design, but you also need to be realistic about your capacity and your situation. The key is to be conscious about what you choose to do and what you choose not to do, or do somewhat differently. For quantitative data, these steps are typically followed. First, you would figure out who you are targeting and how to draw the sample. We're going to talk about this shortly. You'll develop and pilot your instruments like we talked about last week. You'll implement your data collection through, say, a survey or a focus group. You'll analyze your data, and you'll discuss your findings with an evaluation team and key stakeholders. Remember, you are not in this alone, and the interpretation of your results should be a collective effort. Finally, you'll write your report, create your presentations, and share and use those results. You do not need, nor do you want to evaluate every site and survey every person who's involved in your Farm to School program. You have neither the time nor the resources, and happily, drawing a sample is simply a common way to do this in research and evaluation. For a quantitative study, you'll want to consider the purpose of your evaluation to decide what type of sample to take. So you've probably all heard about random samples, and this is often what is considered the right way to choose what people or sites participating in your evaluation. So I have to tell you, random samples are great, but there are just as many other legitimate ways to do your target groups. Remember, in your Farm to School evaluation, you are interested in learning about some very specific outcomes. Look at those outcomes and the purpose of your evaluation to guide how you will select your sites and groups to evaluate. For example, if you want to examine whether students have increased consumption of fruits and vegetables, and you're particularly interested in the increased access and consumption for lower income children, then you would select a school in your district that has high free and reduced lunch rate. While it would be nice to learn about the changes in eating behavior among all the students who have a salad bar with local produce, it's not necessary to find out about everyone when your main interest is of finding out about a subset of students. This non-random approach is called purposeful sampling, and it is the method by which most of you will choose your sites and target populations. Like most of you, will at some point want to conduct surveys, so I'm going to dig into this particular data collection process first. There are many ways to conduct a survey, and the ways that seem to be continually changing. So for example, actually today we can do surveys through social media, you can do texting polls, and so on. I'm not going to cover those. Instead, I'm going to talk about the 4 most common formats. It's important to remember that no one survey method is perfect, and the best format will largely depend on your purpose, time, and capacity to conduct and analyze the results. So we have things we call handout surveys. These are often used at the end of an event or an activity to collect immediate feedback. So for example, if you had a garden preparation day in the spring with parent volunteers, you could use a handout survey. These are a good choice when you want to capitalize on having respondents available. You need or want immediate feedback. You have limited resources and you may not be able to reach the people again. Mail surveys are appropriate under certain conditions, which include you have a complete and accurate mailing list. The people you are surveying are likely to actually respond. You want respondents to have time to consider their answers. You want respondents to have privacy when taking their survey. And you suspect that your respondents are unlikely to have access to the internet. Telephone surveys are appropriate when you need results relatively fast. So here, this would require that your target audience has a phone and you know their phone numbers, that your target audience would have difficulty completing a written questionnaire. That's a great reason to use a telephone survey. You would need your survey questions to be short and easy to understand. You would only want to use a few questions, and you would have to have people who can do the calling. Then there are face-to-face interviews, survey interviews, and they tend to gather the most reliable and complete survey data, but they can be time-consuming and expensive to implement. However, they are appropriate when there is no contact list for the population you want to survey, and there is a concern that people will not respond to a self-administered survey. It is also appropriate if your questions are a bit more complicated because the interviewer can actually answer and clarify questions. And honestly, it's also okay if you really have enough time and budget is not an issue if you're going to have to be spending some money on compensating people to do those interviews. These days, electronic surveys are very common and for good reason. They are inexpensive to administer, and many people communicate electronically these days. There are really two types. There are email surveys, and those are best when the target audience is reachable through an email, so you know their email address. And the survey is short and simple, and you want those results pretty quickly. Web-based surveys are best when the target audience has regular internet users. The survey is a bit more complex, and you or someone on your evaluation team knows how to use a web-based internet service. So thinking about the different data collection formats, which type or types will you want to implement?
Okay, hi everybody. So as you can see, I've opened the poll up on the right side of your screen. And the answer types are handout surveys, mail surveys, telephone surveys, face-to-face surveys, email, or web, or no surveys at all. Looks like some of you are still submitting some responses. Okay, it does look like the majority of you are either going to use handout or web surveys, and some of you were thinking about using email surveys.
Okay, that's great. So everything we're going to talk about today is going to be very connected to the different types that you've identified. So let's move on. Oh, well, look at that. There's my phone. I knew that I was missing a couple of my pictures. Well, they just wanted to show up late. Okay, here we go. Many of you are going to use online surveys in some form or another. I also have to tell you, even if you're not planning to collect the data online, I'm going to talk to you about how you may want to actually use an online survey format, because an online survey format is a very good way for collecting your data and analyzing your data. So don't tune out if you think you're not planning to use an online survey, because I really want you to see the different kinds of things that can happen, because it really is applicable to even those of you who might be doing handout surveys. So there are all different types of question formats that are possible on most online survey services. Here's a screenshot of a multiple choice question, which can be set up to allow only one answer, or, as shown here, allow the respondents to select multiple answers. This particular multiple choice question is set up as a table, which is an efficient way for respondents to answer a series of similar questions. In this case, we were interested in learning what types of assistance a district needed to help them with their farm-to-school program. Our options were a bit more fun than just yes, no, and maybe, and they also gave us more information. So we allowed districts to tell us they were either doing okay, they needed some help, they weren't interested now, or they were really unsure about it. Here is basically that very same question in the previous slide, but it's been formatted to provide the full verbal language that an interviewer would use when conducting a person-to-person telephone survey and collecting that data in the online survey format. You would use a telephone interview when you need to get to very specific people, or in our case, we're using this because we're doing a follow-up with school districts who answered the USDA farm-to-school census, and we're really trying to learn more about where they're at and build a relationship and figure out how the task force can better support their farm-to-school efforts. Here is a scale question where respondents rate the statements on a 5-point scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Here's a very important point. It's important you always label each of your scale choices so there is no ambiguity or confusion about what the scale's value represents. Otherwise, when you go to analyze it, if you haven't actually given your scale values a real name, then you're not going to really know what, say, an average of 3.0 means if you didn't allow them to indicate that it meant neutral. You should always give the option of unsure and not applicable or no opinion on scale questions, because those are real answers for some people, and you don't want them to skip your question And you also don't want them to choose an answer that does not represent how they really are feeling about that particular statement. SurveyMonkey and other online survey tools have the ability to set up ranking questions. Here, respondents are asked to rank each of the 10 statements, where 1 equals the most critical activity needed to create a healthy food environment and 10 being the least critical. Rankings instead of scales are a good choice when you need to get some sense of prioritization. Finally, surveys can include open-ended questions, which will result in qualitative data. You'll need to analyze open-ended questions differently than you would analyze the other data that you're collecting that's quantitative. There are many online survey programs available. All of the ones on this screen have free versions for them, and some of them actually are just free. The free versions typically limit you in some way by the number of questions you can ask or the number of respondents that are allowed. However, even the paid accounts are really quite inexpensive. Let's do another quick poll.
All right, everybody, I'm going to open up a poll there on the right side of your screen. And my question is, what is your comfort level with creating a survey online? And the answers are, I've done it before and found it fun. I've done it before but struggled. I've not done it, but I'm excited to get going. This is new to me, and I'm a bit nervous. And then a quote from famous Dr. Seuss, I would not, could not, on a train, in a plane, on a boat, or with a goat. Okay, great. So let's see here. It looks like about over half of you have done it before and found it fun. Some of you have tried it and struggled. Some of you, it's new, and some of you fall in line with Dr. Seuss.
Thank you, Sophie. Okay, I actually have to admit I answered that particular one, and I picked Dr. Seuss's answer just because I love Dr. Seuss. Okay, moving on. Let's turn our attention now to qualitative data collection. Qualitative data has some very specific place in evaluation, and we've talked about this before, but it's worth repeating some of these and thinking about additional qualities about it. If a survey generates hard to explain or inconsistent findings, a follow-up with a series of focus groups or interviews can help illuminate those numbers and help you make sense of it. When you have numerical outcomes that are diverse, and so diverse that they really become neutralized when they're all averaged together, or you're trying to, figure out why is one group feeling so strongly positive and one group is feeling so strongly negative, then using a case study or doing interviews can be an important way to understand why you've got those splits in your quantitative data. When long-term program outcomes are difficult to measure, you can capture some of those intermediary shifts in attitudes and behaviors through individual interviews. Interviews are also an excellent way to bubble up success stories that you could not have imagined and cannot be relayed in numerical data. And by the way, I have to tell you, stories are very powerful information to share with your stakeholders and your funders. And then finally, qualitative methods deepen, validate, and further describe your quantitative findings. Let's take a look at the ideal qualitative research design. Remember, just like quantitative research design, you want to know what is a best practice, but then you want to be thoughtful in your choices as you consider what is realistic. So you would first define your sample, and there's going to be more on that in a minute. It's slightly different with qualitative. Last week, you learned how to develop a set of thoughtful, targeted, and unbiased questions. You're going to use a systematic process for analyzing qualitative data. Again, more on this shortly. You're going to want to share your results with the evaluation team and stakeholders to get their interpretations. This is not just yours to interpret. It really is a collective effort. And then just like with your quantitative work, you're going to write your report, create your presentations, share and use those results. And really, those are the topics we're going to be covering in next week's webinar. Qualitative sample considerations are somewhat different than quantitative, yet they share the idea of being purposeful. Essentially, what you want is to select individuals from whom you have the most to learn, the ones who can provide insight and deep understanding regarding the topic of interest. There are several techniques available for selecting samples of information-rich cases. I'm just going to point out 3 of the most common strategies. The first one is what we call maximum variation sampling. And what this is a heterogeneous sample that includes individuals with diverse characteristics and experiences. The idea here is that if any patterns will emerge across a diverse set of individuals, this would be very valuable in describing the experiences that are central or core to most individuals. Homogeneous sampling is actually the exact opposite of maximum variation. In contrast to the maximum variation, the homogeneous sampling means individuals are selected according to a narrow set of common characteristics. This is actually most often used when you're selecting participants for a focus group. Snowball sampling is a recruitment technique in which research participants are asked to assist the researchers in identifying other potential subjects. So you could interview somebody, and then at the end of that interview, you might ask that participant to identify other people they believe would have an important perspective about, say, the school garden. You could specify that that person you're looking for would be someone who holds a different perspective than they had, or they had a different experience if you're interested in trying to maximize the diversity. Regardless of the strategy you choose, you should document it, and it will become information about the methods that you have used. You will either incorporate that in your final report, or you'll just be able to share it when somebody asks you, well, how did you select those people? It is likely that qualitative data collection method you're going to use is going to be interviewing. So let's take a look at this method. There are 5 data collection steps involved in interviews. First, you're going to want to finalize your interview questions, which will happen after you have pre-tested that instrument, and we talked about pre-testing last week. Next, you'll identify those interviewees as determined by your sampling selection strategy that we just talked about. I do not underestimate the importance of using your evaluation team members and other key stakeholders to recruit your interviewees. You'll have a better participation rate if someone who knows the person or who is held in high regard requests the person to participate in your evaluation. And when you conduct the interviews, be sure you do not exceed the amount of time you said it would take. It's important to respect a person's schedule, and you'll want your interviewees to care about and maybe even act upon your evaluation results. So make sure they have a good experience. Finally, you'll need to type up your notes that you are conducting when you're doing the interview. This is easiest to do when conducting an interview over the phone because you can do it at the same time, though I have to tell you it's also perfectly okay to take your computer and type as you are interviewing in person. If you're typing up notes as you're doing the interview, make sure you allot time immediately afterwards to clean them up when your memory of that conversation is still fresh. Let's consider 3 types of interviews. The first type is what we call a general interview guide. This is really a guide that is intended to ensure that you capture some of the general ideas, that you're getting those general topics covered. This provides some focus, but allows quite a bit of freedom and adaptability in getting the information from the interviewee. A second method is what we would call a standardized open-ended interview. This would be the same open-ended questions are asked of all interviewees. This approach facilitates faster interviews that can be more easily analyzed and compared. Most of the interview instruments we've identified in the Farm to School Evaluation Toolkit are of this type. And then there are what we call closed fixed response interviews. This is really where all interviewees are asked the same questions and asked to choose the same answers among the same set of alternatives. Honestly, this is really doing an in-person survey with the interviewee. You want to know, now I would like to do a little bit of a different kind of interactive method. And so we thought what we would do is give you some scenarios about different data collection methods and have you figure out what might be the best method to use. So this is going to be your turn, and you're going to this time, instead of doing a poll, you're going to type your answers into a chat box, and please select all panelists so we both can see. And we have 3 different scenarios that we're going to give to you. Here comes the first one. We would like to know, how would you collect data if what you were looking for was young children's attitudes towards fresh fruits and vegetables? So tell us, what type of data would you want to collect, qualitative or quantitative? What type of data collection tool do you think you would use? Would it be a survey? Would it be an interview? Would it be a focus group? And justify for us why you would select that type of data and use that type of tool. Okay, this is going to take a little bit of time because that's a lot of typing, but I'd love to see some of your ideas here. And by the way, there really are no wrong answers. It really is about the way that you put this together and whether or not it is the strongest way to do it. So go ahead and start sharing. Okay, we have ones that are starting to come in. So we have some folks who are saying that they are planning to use both qualitative and even within a survey. So actually I love that because that is the idea that you're using a survey format, but you're planning to collect some of that open-ended data in your survey. So that's great. Here is another one, a survey. And the example here is we did this before, where we had kids drop colored coins into cups of various vegetables before lessons. Then after the lessons, after lessons and exposure to vegetables and fruit, we asked them to do the same thing and saw if any changes existed. This is qualitative and easy to do with small children. I love that. What a great idea. So that comes from Christy. And Christy, I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to totally post that on our Google group, and I may even use that as an example in future trainings. And let's see, others that are coming in. Here's one from Julie, and she says she would use a quantitative one. And the example is, how do you eat apples and bananas and so on? The survey would be paper and pencil, or it could be an interview, and you'd be working with young children. You could show pictures and use a combination of survey and interviews to get a variety of information. So yes, that's a great example of really kind of that mixed method of quantitative and qualitative. So that's an excellent example. And here's one from Jackie who says, depending on the definition of young, assuming that there are some slightly older elementary school children, I would collect both qualitative and quantitative data. We're doing it now. We've done a survey about willingness to try new foods in the form of a survey, as well as conducting taste tests, plate waste studies before and after adding new local recipes with vegetables. Wow, that's fantastic. These are great examples. Yes, and other people are noting that it's really important to show pictures, both for young kids, but also for those children who might be older and they're really just visual learners. And so it's really, I love that you're thinking about learning, you know, different learning strengths of children and showing and using those different ways of collecting data with them, thinking about their different learning strategies. So let's move on to scenario number 2. Okay, tell me, how would you collect information about the skills and knowledge of fresh food preparation among your food service staff? Oh, and please do, when you send it, please look at that little send to and select all panelists, because that way both Sophie and I can see it. So I'm sure all of you have this same experience in your farm to school programs, which is that we have lots and lots of cafeteria and food service staff who, they haven't had to work with fresh produce for a long time. And so getting their skills up is a really important component of making farm to school work. So here comes one from Christy. She says entirely qualitative. She would do this by asking each of the district nutrition managers what the barriers to local procurement was. This was something that came up in conversation. So it wasn't a great survey or evaluation example in process. So I think that actually really does bring up some important components about when you are most likely to get in-depth interview or information, and really that's going to come through the qualitative method. And when those kinds of things happen and come up naturally in a conversation, that might in fact be the way that you want to start gathering that information. Here's another one from Christopher, and he says, a qualitative interview gets specific information that's based on 20 years of experience, knowledge of industry coworkers' experience as well. So that's great. That is really delving deep into recognizing both the experience side that you have within food services and the importance of capturing that in a qualitative and in-depth way. Other things, so let me add some. Oh, here comes one. Completing a survey with both quantitative scales and some open-ended questions via the survey, a competency survey, sorry, and then follow up with semi-structured interviews if the number of staff is doable and there is capacity. So that's great, and I'm glad you mentioned that because I was going to say we do in fact have some survey instruments that are in our toolkit that really are about this kind of skills and knowledge that can be done through a quantitative methods. Again, I love that so many of you are talking about the mixed methods because that really is how you understand your numbers. And then one last one I'm going to say, which is that we've done this a bit ad hoc. We've provided a 3-hour training by a culinary trained chef to all of our grant schools kitchen staff, great. We provided them with new recipes and we did a post interviews with those taking the training right after the training about their thoughts and helpfulness of the training. Then we plan to complete a survey on how they are utilizing their training. Terrific. These are great examples. One more scenario, and then we'll move on to analyzing the data. Tell me why key stakeholders support the Farm to School program. How would you find out about that? If you wanted to know why are your key stakeholders supporting your Farm to School program, how would you go about collecting that data? Okay, I'm going to wait just a little bit longer. Maybe some of you who haven't jumped in before might give us some ideas. I'm going to give you a hint. The very first word is really important. Thank you. Julie is telling us that she would use a focus group. Qualitative data to provide an open forum and brainstorm the reasons why they support, how they support, and ideas for improvement. Absolutely. That whole why part is very much about qualitative data. You're going to get your best if you do it through qualitative data. Here's another semi-structured interviews, both on the phone as well as focus groups, if it makes sense to dive deep with certain kinds of groups. Excellent idea. That was from Ryan. And Christopher says a quantitative survey can limit can be limited to the top 5 reasons and then measure and graph it easier. So actually that is true. You can definitely create a whole long list of different kinds of reasons why. And you know, a really great way to do that would be if you did a focus group first, or maybe you did a couple of interviews first and you gathered those kinds of reasons why people support it, and then use that to create that quantitative survey with the type of reasons people actually support it. That's a great way to utilize a qualitative to inform your quantitative. We've really been talking about how qualitative is there to interpret your quantitative, but it also can be used to help inform how to develop a good quantitative survey. I'm going to end with that because we have quite a bit more to still cover, but thank you. Those are great ideas. Okay, let's explore how to analyze all this data we've now collected. We'll be doing more of this next week because analyses and choices for how you report your results are actually very highly related. So we're going to be touching on data analysis again next week, going a little bit more in depth when it makes sense. We need to look at the methods for analyzing both quantitative and qualitative data because, of course, they're quite different. So let's start with quantitative data. Here, I'm showing you an example of a spreadsheet. So some of the questions you would ask in a survey are likely to be yes/no questions or agree/disagree questions or some other type of kind of categorical data or list of options. These types of questions can best be analyzed by counting up the number of respondents who answered each of the options. If you enter each survey each person you surveyed into a spreadsheet, such as an Excel, with one line per survey respondent in each column representing the answer to that question, it can make it easier to count up the responses. There's actually some really great resources, and we have links to those in our evaluation toolkit. And we'll also be posting some of this information on the Google group of information of how you can use an Excel sheet to do some very simple analyses of your data. Now getting back to that online survey program like SurveyMonkey, even if you weren't going to collect the data directly online, the reason why you may want to use SurveyMonkey is by entering your own data you've collected from paper and pencil, from those that you gave out at the garden or wherever. SurveyMonkey has some great and easy options for how to analyze the data. So if this means that you actually wouldn't need to necessarily have a research person who knows how to use Excel spreadsheets or some other kind of data analytics, and you can have the opportunity to create bar graphs and various kinds of frequency distributions and so on, as you can see. We're going to actually look at a bunch of those next week. I want to turn our attention to qualitative data analysis because this is one where I think it's really underappreciated. Qualitative data can really be overwhelming in the sheer amount that's collected just in one interview, but also in terms of how to even make sense of it. Too often, our qualitative data is simply used to pepper a report with some quotes that demonstrate a point that the writer is trying to make. So I want to tell you right now that not only does that approach underutilize the effort your team and your participants put into being in the evaluation, it also actually misrepresents what you could have learned by doing a more systematic review of the data. Qualitative data, as much as we want to make it seem more objective by turning it into numbers, is a poor choice. And I'm bringing this up because I think that we all have this tendency to really want to quantify because it just feels like, you know, more solid. But I'm going to really impress upon you that in the same way that you don't want to just use a few quotes which might suggest they represent everyone that you've interviewed, you also don't want to give percentages or counts to the number of interviewees who mentioned a particular aspect of your program. However, you can say something about how frequently you hear a particular reason. For example, you might be able to say that the most frequent reason producers cited for wanting to continue selling to schools Was there satisfaction knowing that they were feeding healthy food to students in their community? So you can give a quantitative-like component to your qualitative data, but you really do not want to say 5 people said this, 10 people said that, because in fact you did not have the opportunity for everyone or even a sample of everyone to chime in. And so it's a misrepresentation of your data. It's worth remembering a very important thing here. Not everything that can be measured matters, and not everything that matters can be measured. We certainly can measure a lot of things that do matter, but there's a whole lot out there that gets measured that does not matter. And numbers alone are not our goal. And qualitative data collection instruments, if they're well designed, should be collecting information that cannot be measured, but it really, really matters. So what are the mechanics of coding? There are many ways it can be done, and let me show you a couple. If your notes or transcript is in a word processing file, you could just simply do this. You could highlight those passages that, pop out and they're of real interest to you. You could use different highlighting colors if you wanted. You can use comment cards in the margins to kind of give codes or labels to different themes you're seeing. So here are 2 passages about strategies. In this case, the strategy of using policy to make changes in the school food environment. In the yellow highlighted sentence, the respondent says that sugar-sweetened beverages are simply not his top priority, but the green highlight shows that salad bars is what the respondent really cares about. Over to the side, you can see that comment cards were used to create little codes or a shorthand for what was said there. So sugar-sweetened beverages is not a policy priority, and school salad bars are a priority. You can also use Excel or some other spreadsheet to organize and categorize your data. Here, the answers to an open-ended survey question are recorded in a spreadsheet, and that's marked in column Q10. So it's actually column I, and it says Q10 on the top of it, along with some demographic data, which is over to the left with the brown headers, and on the right side are blue headers, which are the coding themes that emerged in the process of reading these answers. If a theme is represented in an answer, a 1 is put in the column of that code. A passage can have more than one code. So for example, we can see that the first response in row 3 has been coded on the themes of political shift and community and culture of healthy food. There's also software you can use to code your qualitative data. Until recently, such software has been quite expensive. But one affordable option now is available as an online service, and one of those is called DeDoose. It charges a relatively small monthly fee, and it only charges for the months that you actually use it. For most of you, this goes well beyond the level of coding you would ever need to do, but for the few of you who are interested, I encourage you to take a look. There are other online free programs out there. One is called QDA Minor Lite. Another is called West QDA. They both and all work pretty much the same. Again, you really don't need to go on to online programs, but some people really like to do this, and you do have those options out there. Once you have your data collected and coded, you will have multiple options to find out the patterns and unexpected outcomes in it. So you can sort and reassemble your data by the codes that you've given it, thereby discovering if there are certain perspectives more likely to be articulated by, say, your garden leaders than the teachers who use the gardens. You can reassemble your codes by using categories. Categories are kind of like a collection of smaller subcodes, and they get to these larger themes, and you can see how those group together. You can select and look at relationships among the categories or themes. And finally, you can look at the relative weight given to certain types of themes. And so while you're not counting, it is interesting and could be insightful to discover that certain groups talk more frequently about one thing, but others rarely mention it. You can code in SurveyMonkey. You can do this qualitative coding in SurveyMonkey. And so here's a screenshot of that same data that I showed you in the Excel spreadsheet, but now here it is in SurveyMonkey. One of the things that's kind of nice here in SurveyMonkey is that you can also then display that data by its relative frequency. And you can see here that the comments about a culture of healthy food were mentioned in 50% of those comments. Word clouds are a fun and easy way to represent ideas that show up frequently in your interviews or focus groups, and there are several online sites that can create these word clouds. And also, again, you can do those in SurveyMonkey. So how about if you tell us just really quickly, what does the audience for your evaluation want to know? So the idea here is to think about who you're speaking to with your evaluation and what do you think is going to be most meaningful to them. And maybe just a couple examples and we'll jump forward and finish off this training. We have just a couple more slides to go. So Jackie tells us that whether or not students like the new recipes and are actually eating more healthy foods. Great. Christy says that the purpose of evaluation, the results as well, and the bigger picture potentially. So that makes a lot of sense. You're really talking about that you've got some audience members, it sounds like, out there who know that you are evaluating, and they're really going to want to know what the purpose of that evaluation is, as well as you're going to use the purpose of your evaluation to figure out what you really need to collect. So that's good. And Laura mentions if there's an increased access to fruits and vegetables. So I want you to remember to think about your audience. You always want to think about your audience. We made this connection way back at the very first webinar. But your audience is ultimately what it's all about. Who is it you're speaking to in your webinar, or I'm sorry, in your evaluation? What is the purpose? Because it's that purpose you need to keep going back to when you think about what you're doing, how you're doing it, how you're collecting the data, what you're asking the questions, all of those things. And here is one more from Ryan, who says that the purpose, what his audience wants to know is the service impact, which really means the kids reached, the pounds of produce introduced and grown, the consumption of healthy food patterns. So these are all really wonderful ways of understanding exactly what you need to do to move forward with an effective and targeted evaluation. Keep those in mind. You do not want to collect all the data that's available in your very complex and rich programs that you have out there. You want to stay focused on what it is that you are doing this evaluation for and who you're talking to. There are some additional resources that I want to point you to. These are actually also resources that are linked at the very end of our evaluation toolkit overview. And this includes the Pell's Institute's Evaluation Toolkit, the Community Toolbox, a site called Mira, and also Asking Questions That Matter. There's a lot of great information on all of these for how to conduct evaluations. They're very, very friendly sites, and they'll give you even more depth. So with that, I am going to wrap it up and have us open it up for Q&A. I just want to remind you that, like always, we have a short survey that follows this, and I really hope that you will participate in it. It, like the last time, it will ask you what it is that you're hoping to learn from the last webinar this time on reporting your results. And if everyone wants to join the Google group, if you haven't already, please do go to this link and sign up. We're going to start using that Google group a little more proactively. Sophie and I will begin placing some resources and additional links on that Google group, and hoping that that really kind of jumpstarts some activity on there and some good questions, and also encourages other people to share things that they're finding out there. Okay, I'm going to open it up for Q&A. We actually are exactly at 1 p.m., but we'll, again, leave it open for about 2 minutes for anybody who would like to ask some questions. I'm going to, in next week's webinar, just a reminder that people who do attend all 5 of these webinars took the pre-series survey and will be taking the post-series test, which is an option by simply saying you want to take it for credit. Those folks are going to be eligible for continuing education credits. We've actually are pretty excited to be able to share next week that we have several other professional associations that are offering the credits, and so, or will take the credits that we are offering through Metro. So there's that information I will share with you next week. And if we have any questions, I don't see any coming in at this point. How about I'll ask you all a question, and you could just type it in, yes or no. Do you feel like you're more confident in have a few more skills to implement your evaluation well? Yes, no, maybe. Great. There's a yes. Thank you. I'm excited. Another yes. Yeah. And so let's see. And one more yes. Great. And yes, thanks for all your work. Hey, thank you. We are really excited to share this toolkit, and I have to tell you just before you all log off that Sophie and I are really having a great time thinking about how to do evaluation by literally doing the training, how to make it really make sense. And it also is making us realize that there's so much more we could be sharing. So that's one of the reasons that I think it makes sense for us to become more active on the Google group, because honestly, we end up removing slides. We just don't have time to tell you all the things that we think are really cool and would be helpful to you. So we're going to share more of that, but we'll do that offline, and hope to see you next week for the final webinar on how to report out your results. Okay, thanks everyone. Have a great week.